what has happened in Qatar. We talked about it before, and we had a summit in Doha. How did you find this summit, and how do you see the countries in the Middle East, in the West Asia, and the way that they're seeing the escalations on the part of Israelis, and what do they want to do with this sort of summit, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I wanted to comment on your shirt because I find it a bit strange that you wear this shirt with me, but you're wearing a different shirt with Larry. And I feel that you're very biased. You're basically wearing your clothes as like Larry wears it, and that's I find it unacceptable. We have to have a show together with Larry, and then see ultimately which shirt you choose, and that way we'll know which side you're on. But Nima, what is happened in Qatar, in my opinion, and at the UN Security Council before that, uh, is not important in the sense that there's going to be some sudden sea change in policy. Qatar does not have that sort of courage. The Emiratis, the Saudis, they're not going to move away from the American camp. Turkey will continue to allow uh, oil to flow to the Israeli regime from the Republic of Azerbaijan, Jordan. It will allow food to get in, food that goes from the Emirates to Saudi to the Jordanians, and circumventing the Red Sea. The Egyptians will continue to do business as usual. That is not going to change anything. But the language has become much more harsh. And that is reflective, in my opinion, of a reality that the world is changing, that people on the streets are becoming increasingly impatient. These governments, after all, they're not reflective of public opinion. In none of these countries are people happy with their policies, including in the Emirates and in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia or in Turkey or anywhere. But they have to be seen as remaining relevant. So it is hardening their stance. We see a hardening of the stance against the Israeli regime. The Algerian and the Pakistani governments, their position at the UN Security Council were also very tough. And the language used by some of these countries is becoming increasingly similar to the language of the resistance and the axis of resistance. Not that they're behaving in that way. And the right thing, of course, to do, in my opinion, is that they have to cut off all ties immediately, economic, political, and cultural, and just end the relationship permanently with the regime. But in any case, this shift, I think, if you look at it in the broader context of how the world is turning against the Israeli regime, the UN is finally, after almost 2 years, calling this a genocide. Remember, during the first few months, Western media and Western governments and Western elites were trying to justify the genocide by lying about beheadings and the rape of women, and they still try to do that, but no one takes them seriously anymore. But back then, they bought time for the regime by doing that. And then we saw the world turning against the regime, and but still, the West tried to be apologetic. They lied for it. Western media lied for it. Western intelligence agencies would lie for it. When they bombed the first hospital, uh, they pretended that it was the Palestinians who did it by mistake, or and but then they started bombing hospital after hospital, and they'd go into the hospitals and unplug the incubators and murder the infants. And so they couldn't defend them in that way anymore. They had to be apologetic in a different way. And then you had the South African complaint, where back then, despite Western pressure, they said that this could possibly be a genocide. It was a genocide back then, but Western pressure and European pressure and North American pressure and Australia and others, they just like the ICC, they forced them to do far less than they should have. But gradually, things continue to get worse. for the Israeli regime. Its isolation grew, the Western isolation grew, US isolation grew, and even in the United States, Charlie Kirk, the death of Charlie Kirk has become an issue, regardless of who murdered him. I have no idea. But it's coming out that his relationship with the Zionists was much more problematic than we thought. And many people are raising questions about the role of the Israeli regime in his assassination. Why? Because the Israeli regime is killing people across the region. They bomb even Qatar, which is the closest U.S. ally in the region by far. Qatar is completely submissive to the United States. It does nothing that it runs in conflict with U.S. interests. As we know now, or as we knew before, but as everyone knows now, Hamas is in Qatar because the United States wanted them to be there. The Israeli regime wanted them to be there. Qatar's wealth goes to the West. And even during um, the World Cup, when they were building hotels and stadiums and infrastructure and a metro which is now empty, uh, the those who carried out the construction companies and those who were developing all of these, they were linked to powerful people in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, making huge billions of dollars just for the world during the World Cup, so that the Qataris could have U.S. protection. So they gave them a base. They pay for U.S. expenses in the base, in the Al Udeid base. They're constantly funding the West. All of their wealth, their wealth fund is more or less spent in ways in which please the United States, but yet they are still bombed. So when this happens, then people think, things like this. They see the death of Charlie Kirk as being suspicious in the sense that it could quite possibly, especially since the story provided by the FBI is so full of holes, that people are suspicious about the role of the Israeli regime. Now, I have no idea personally about what happened, but the point is that the regime has become despised across the world. And so this rhetoric or this language, the statements coming out of the summit the gathering of Arab leaders and Muslim leaders, this I think has to be we have to it is if you look at it in a in a vacuum, it's disappointing. And I wasn't expecting anything more than this, by the way. But when you look at it within the context of this broader shift that's taking place across the world, this is not good news for the Israeli regime. In fact, as I said, I believe that a lot of the problems that now exist inside the United States, the divisions that we see, are linked to the Israeli regime, not just because of the 2 years of genocide and how the United States fully supports it. And the US Secretary of State goes to Palestine at a time when this new wave of terror is taking place in Gaza and fully supporting it. Not just that, but the fact that the regime is literally out of control, waging wars, getting the United States involved in their foreign wars, something that Charlie Kirk was had a problem with. He didn't want the U.S. to get involved in the conflict with Iran, between the war that the Israeli regime engaged with Iran. So we're seeing now that not only is the Israeli regime isolating the United States and the West internationally, but it's causing big problems at home for the Zionist elites in the United States and in the broader West. So I think this is just another brick in this wall. It is that's isolating the Israeli regime. And so while I'm sure that people are disappointed and they do see these countries as really betraying the Palestinian cause, the Turks should have ended, Erdogan should have ended the relationship. Morocco should have done the same. Egypt should have done the same. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates, they should have all just cut off ties. Bahrain, but but the shift in language is notable, and I think it's reflective of the fact that these countries, these governments, feel the need to uh, be more harsh. And when you put all that together with what's happening elsewhere and the UN General Assembly, this is not good news for the Israeli regime. And by the way, it also strengthens Iran. It strengthens Iran because it shows to Iranians and to the international community that doing a deal with the United States gets you nowhere. What deal could the Iranians possibly do with the Americans to prevent the United States or the Israeli regime from attacking Iran? Because without a doubt, what happened in Qatar was with U.S. coordination. There's zero doubt about that. It's impossible for the Israeli regime to do it without U.S. Not, without the U.S. being informed well beforehand and giving the green light. But so it tells basically Iranians that what sort of deal works. If the Qataris who are obedient to the United States have no protection and they actually have a huge US base, then what about it? And then it also strengthens Hezbollah's position. Hezbollah now says, what deal can Lebanon do with the Israeli regime or the United States that would protect Lebanon without the arms of the resistance? So, what happened in Qatar hurt the Israeli regime in many ways.
I think what you've mentioned for the case of Charlie Kirk, Professor Marandi, you're talking about the Middle East is somehow changing. The mindset of the people, leader, are somehow changing toward Israel. But Charlie Kirk was a very important example of what is happening in the United States. Those people who were supporting Israel before and who started questioning the position of Israel. What do they want to do? What is the main reason of this sort of behavior on the part of Israelis? Because he started not only about the behavior of Israel, he went to White House, he talked with Donald Trump about the attack on Iran. He said, "Why do we need to go to it? Why do we need to attack Iran? This continuous war in the Middle East doesn't benefit the United States." These are huge questions on the part of these people who are supporting, who are the main supporters of Donald Trump and MAGA movement. I think what's going on in the United States is somehow tremendous. It's huge what's going on there with these movements. Charlie Kirk was part of this movement. And how do you find that in the United States?
I think that this is a huge turning point because already, as we all know, popular opinion has been turning against the regime, despite the media, despite the political elite, despite the government in the United States and in Europe. Popular opinion has turned away from them, especially the youth, and their last strongholds were among the conservatives and the conservative part of the conservative youth. And he was representative of that. And he was a major force in US politics as a result. But he was completely supportive of the genocide and the regime. And I mean, we cannot whitewash his past. I mean, his things that he said, and many of them were deeply disturbing. However, he was shifting for whatever reason, whether he saw the light, as they say, or whether it was because he saw that uh, his own audience was changing. Recall when Tucker Carlson spoke at that event that he hosted, and the youth were on his side. So he perhaps also felt that he could lose his influence and his relevance if he stuck with the genocidal regime, or perhaps uh, he did have a change in heart, or his eyes were increasingly open. I cannot, speculate on what was going on in his heart at that time, but there was a change. And now we see the gray zone and others, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, speaking in recent hours about Max Blumenthal, speaking about uh, more information coming out. And again, because of all the holes in the FBI story, that makes it even more uh, questionable. But I don't know what happened, but the point is that the Israeli regime has become so despised and it's become such a problem that people find it understandable or acceptable or believable despite the Western media, despite the politicians, despite, because you're not going to see any of this in the Western media. This is only online. This is only, the likes of Candace Owens and others who are pushing this. But despite that, it's believable. Why? Because of the nature of the regime. Because because it's and then we see Trump about doing exactly the opposite of what he promised to do, engaging in more wars, continuing with the genocide. And it obviously wasn't very helpful for him to be seen sort of dancing in the stadium hours after Charlie Kirk died, or when a reporter asked him how he was coping, and then he spoke about the the ballroom that they're making. That indifference to Charlie Kirk, who apparently loved him, uh, all of this is harming uh, the, the 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 Israeli regime. It's harming the Zionist uh, forces in the United States. So it's become an internal issue. It's not, and also what the Israeli regime did to Qatar has created fear for China and for other countries, because now it's clear that the Israeli regime has ambitions to control Western Asia. And this is the source of much of the world's energy, oil and gas as well. So it's not just Iran or Yemen or Hezbollah who are trying to stop the Israeli regime from continuing its genocide. This is about the entire West Asia, which is in the American camp. Even there, the Israeli regime feels it has to dominate, whether it's Turkey or whether it's Qatar or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or anyone else. Now the Israelis are saying we will bomb whoever we want, whenever we want. Even though Trump, after the bombing, wrote that this will not happen again, immediately afterwards, Netanyahu said it will happen whenever we decide that it is to happen. So the United States, its credibility across the board is declining. It is seen as a full partner, as as the UN has called, finally, after almost 2 years, called this a genocide. We see the US Secretary of State going to Palestine and giving his absolute 100% support for the genocide in Gaza. That is hurting the United States internationally. And then simultaneously, the regime is intensifying the slaughter, and then it's bombing new countries like Qatar. And then you have the issue of Charlie Kirk, his death, regardless of who was behind it. But this is creating a crisis of sorts at home, which is intensifying, in my opinion, the, the wave against the Israeli regime in the United States. So this is a global wave, but it is also something that is happening in the United States as well. It's delayed in the United States. It took place slow in the United States, but this was the last stronghold of the regime in the United States. Charlie Kirk and his and his organization was, I think, their last hope among the youth, and or at least conservative youth in the United States.